Hello and welcome to another episode of Change One Thing, the show where we explore if tomorrow will really be what tomorrow will be. Hello, Lani here, and on this episode I'm joined by Professor Emma Kowal. Emma is an ARC Future Fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute of Deakin University. She's a cultural and medical anthropologist and is a research dynamo who is highly accomplished and awarded in her field. Emma is an expert on the health issues facing Indigenous Australians, the ethics of Indigenous remains, the impacts of colonisation, and the challenge of finding the best way forward. She's also an expert on freezing and gave Deakin University's 2018 Harrison Lecture on the topic. In 2017, Emma established the Science and Society Network, which aims to bring researchers from across different disciplines to work together and help meet the great challenges of this century. Emma was a super engaging guest who had so much knowledge about areas of our history that often get overlooked. You're going to find this chat highly informative, so let's get to it. Change One Thing with Professor Emma Kowal. Well, welcome, Emma. You're described as a research dynamo, and specifically you're a cultural and medical anthropologist. Tell me, have you always been interested in human behaviour?
Absolutely, yeah, as long as I can remember, I suppose. So I got into my field of research through a kind of not a straight path at all. So I started off doing medicine at university, at the University of Melbourne, many years ago now, as a sparkly 17-year-old. And when I started, I realised that I missed English literature from high school, actually. I just felt it was just too much telling me facts and trying to stuff facts into my head. So I picked up on the side doing medicine, some literature subjects, and then I ended up doing a whole arts degree and doing an honours year in medical anthropology, which was really exciting. I did a really great project in Papua New Guinea and kind of got a taste for doing research, my own independent research. And then when I finished finally from this marathon 8-year undergraduate degree. So if uni students think that it's taking a long time, try 8 years. So I left Victoria, left Melbourne and went to the Northern Territory and to work as a doctor because I was really passionate about Aboriginal health and Aboriginal justice.
And were your parents did you grow up in an environment that sort of helped lead you down that research path of, originally medicine, but was that a bit impactful on you?
Yeah, well, it's one of these things that it's easier to see in retrospect. At the time you just, I suppose, do whatever seems like a good idea to do. But yeah, looking back, I think my own background was really important to where I've ended up, and particularly all my 4 grandparents were all Holocaust survivors from Poland. So I've got that Polish surname with a Polish W, and they'd all come as refugees to Australia. And then my parents were born after they came. So growing up, I suppose, in some ways in different worlds, in that I was, normal kid at primary school, but I've had this background of all of these Holocaust survivors, and in my grandparents and their community of friends, and knowing that these really horrible things had happened to my family and the family of a lot of other people that I knew. So I think only more recently have I kind of seen that my commitment to social justice, to providing opportunity for people has been really important. All of my grandparents didn't have the opportunity to have an education at all in little towns in eastern Poland, but when they came to Australia, their children went to university because there was free education at that time, and they were able to become really successful and really great contributors to Australian society. So I'm really passionate about providing opportunity.
And I'm sure they had some incredible stories. Did you do a bit of delving and a bit of research into their, like your family's past? Was that something that you explored a little bit more deeply, or did you just hear stories from them as a child about it?
Yeah, look, I think when you grow up with that in your background, you hear stories over time. I mean, survivors and really any people who have experienced severe trauma have different ways of dealing with it. Some people like to talk about it. Some people don't want to talk about it. But things get passed down, whether it's through words or through other ways.
Yes, exactly. As a young doctor, Emma, after graduating from the University of Melbourne, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, you set off to the Northern Territory but soon encountered many challenges working with the Indigenous people in Northern Territory. Can you tell us about this time? I'm sure it was very formative for your research that you went into.
Yeah, it was. So when I finished medicine, I was at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and I did not want to be a medical officer in one of those big hospitals. I just felt that they were very hierarchical, and it wasn't the kind of medicine that I wanted to practice. So I went off and did my internship, the first year of working as a doctor in the Royal Darwin Hospital. So people would ask me, did they send you there? But actually...
You volunteered?
No, I had to get a job there. And I was, it wasn't easy to get a job there because it is, for a particular kind of doctor, it's really a sought-after place to work. And it was very formative. It was formative to see up close the really obvious effects of colonialism and of inequality and what we call in the social sciences structural violence, like the really a structural inequality over time that produces what you see in many remote communities. And working in the Royal Darwin Hospital, you see it all. About 70% of the patients are Aboriginal, many of them from remote communities. So it is, it was a massive education for me.
Yes, some fast learning, I would assume. So you have two specific lines of research. Let's talk about the first one, Australian racial politics. Can you describe your research that you've done around this?
Yeah, well, this came out really of that experience of working in Aboriginal health. So I was working initially in the hospital, and I'm a big picture person. I kind of realised that towards the end of my medical degree, and so I moved reasonably quickly into working into public health, Aboriginal public health, and then Aboriginal public health research, even more complicated, but that's where you figure out how to do public health better. So I enjoyed clinical medicine. I really enjoyed helping people one by one, but I also wanted to have an impact on preventing the need for them to come to hospital in the first place. How do we improve people's health in the communities where they're living? That seemed to me obviously a better option if you could choose. So, and in public health research, we learn how to do things better. We try different things out, see what works, see what doesn't work, and try to be able to spend the few public health dollars that governments will devote to public health to spend them in the best way possible. So I was working in public health research and with some medical work at the Aboriginal Health Service kind of on the side. And after a while, I kind of was struck by the situation I was in. So we had a lot of people like myself who are non-Indigenous, who'd come from the cities because of their passion for trying to address Indigenous disadvantage. And then we had Indigenous people obviously working in research as well, Indigenous researchers, and then people in the communities who we were trying to help. And it struck me that this was kind of an anthropological problem. Like, what did it mean for people like me, white, middle class, left-wing, progressive people, to come, leave their homes where they were brought up and come and try and work with Aboriginal people with very specific ideas about how they might have positive effects. And specifically, they did not want to be telling Indigenous people what to do because that would be assimilationist, or that would be just like the colonial people who'd done this in the past, like missionaries, for example. So through really experiencing doing this work and reflecting on it, I realised that this group of non-Indigenous people was actually really interesting and had very specific views and a specific culture, which had a lot of influence on how Indigenous programs played out.
Of course.
So I thought, this sounds interesting. So I did my PhD on that.
Wow. And did you ever sort of go out and stay in some of the remote Aboriginal communities just to get sort of a sense of how their culture fascinates me, and even some of their medical practices from ancient times are just amazing and were actually way ahead of their time. Did you get to spend some time learning about the culture in any of the communities?
Yep. I spent a time in a few different communities. Probably Elcho Island was the place where I spent most time, and I worked a lot with a group called Yalu, which was a education and research group that of women who and I worked with them to help build their organisation and build their capacity to interact with research and service organisations. So that was really formative time. And yeah, absolutely, the linguistic diversity, the cultural diversity of Aboriginal communities in this country is absolutely amazing. And that's something that we need to be doing more about, supporting those communities.
And another element of your research has been settler colonisation and post-colonialism research. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, yeah. Well, it is, I suppose, another aspect of what I've just been talking about, that the fact that we live in a country that was colonised by the British, and that the Aboriginal population was completely decimated, over and over again, originally by disease, frontier wars, and then we might say the slow violence of poor services, poor access to services, and intergenerational trauma, stolen generations. I mean, the list goes on. So for all Australians, whether you are really engaged in Indigenous issues or not, whether you've been here, your family's been here since the first fleet, or if you're just off the boat, we all benefit from the fact that the land was stolen and the resources were stolen and that people were murdered. So, and I suppose going back to my own background, I feel strongly that we need to acknowledge that. I mean, my own family, even though we were fleeing persecution and trying to find a place that we could be allowed to live, hopefully flourish, but at least just not be murdered. I also have to accept the responsibility of living on stolen land and benefiting from a government which is continuous with the colonisers, and the whole idea of terra nullius, which we know now is is a fiction. The idea that Aboriginal people were not here, that nobody was here. That was the legal basis of Australian colonisation and of the Australian state. And although we've had things like native title that have tried to account for that or acknowledge that, and terra nullius is officially not recognised within law, it doesn't take away the fact that the Australian state fundamentally is based on a lie. So of course it's something that you can't we can't go back to 1788, and I don't think anyone's proposing that, but we do need to really take seriously the effects of colonisation and the effects of where our country is based, the effects of that on everything that we do.
What do you think of the national apology that Australia what word am I looking for? Yeah. What? So that was a few years ago now. What do you think that helped? Sort of that national apology. Do you think that helped the situation of sort of what happened and how we're dealing with things now, or did it create more of a divide?
Well, from my perspective, it was absolutely a good thing. And I was in Federation Square with many other Australians watching it on the big screen back in 2008, and it was magical. It was really a special moment, and tears were flowing, and it was a very diverse group of people. So, of course, we need to apologise for so many things. And those what you might call symbolic gestures are really important. But so is action, and those things have to go together.
Yeah, I agree. I grew up on the Murray River, and we were actually immersed in Indigenous culture through school. Like at a young age, we had, we were given Aboriginal names, and we learned a lot about the culture up there. Tell me, is there any sort of myths that we've been taught around the colonialism issue?
Well, one way to think about that is massacre sites. I mean, that's something that there's a really great website which what's it called? I think it's called The Names of Places.
Yeah.
But I'd want to check that. There's a really great website just recently released that maps all of the massacre sites in Australia. And our frontier wars, as Henry Reynolds wrote about many years ago, a really important historian, are a really important part of our history. So I would like to see those frontier wars talked about alongside the other important wars that have been part of Australia's history. So that would be a good start.
Yes. Well, when you think of, Anzac Day and all the things that we acknowledge with that, that could be something that could definitely be tied into Australia's history, speaking of those frontier wars. Are we still dealing with racism and anti-racism, and how far do we have to go in this aspect in Australia when it comes to Indigenous people now?
Well, look, racism is an increasing issue in this country and all around the world. So if I was even talking to you 5 years ago, I would be very concerned about racism. Now I've kind of gone up to red alert on racism, and sorry, it's not a laughing matter, but it's about Indigenous people, but it's about Muslim people, it's about Jewish people. The rise of the far right in this country and in many countries in the world is of massive concern, and the government needs to be doing more.
So you've spoken in the media, Emma, in regards to Indigenous DNA testing and ethics around Indigenous remains. What issues are we facing in regards to these two topics?
Yes, thank you. After my work trying to understand the experiences of non-Indigenous people, like an unusual group to look at, but I felt really important to understand the culture of non-Indigenous people who are working in Indigenous fields. I finished that work up, and it really, in some ways, it ended up being about cultural difference. Like, how do we understand the cultural difference of Indigenous people, and how do this group of non-Indigenous people conceptualise the kind of difference that Aboriginal people have. And as I was moving from my PhD into thinking about, well, what comes next? What's my next project? I was interested in the idea of biological difference. So I spent some time at the University of California during my PhD as a visiting scholar. And during that time, the first so-called ethnic drug was released in the US. So this was a drug that lowered blood pressure, but it was just for African Americans. So this was back in 2005, and it was really quite surprising because we were told, as in the general public was told in the early 2000s, that there was no such thing as race. There's no such thing as different races with different genes because all of our genes are 99.9% the same. This was the outcome of the Human Genome Project, which was a huge amount of resources put into sequencing the human genome. And so just a few years after that, we had this drug for African Americans. So it seemed to be a really strange situation. How do we get to a place where there's a drug for a particular racial group? And it turned out that the science of genetics, rather than finding out that we're all the same, what attention was being paid to those really small ways in which different groups of humans are different to each other. And these were being really focused on by drug companies who could see it as an avenue for new markets, but eventually also by researchers who thought that these very small areas of difference could actually be important for health. So this led me to think about genetics in the context of Aboriginal health. And at the time, it was seen as a very stigmatised science. So in Aboriginal health, and because of these issues of colonialism that we talked about before, there is a lot of baggage about research in general, but particularly about things like measuring heads, looking at different blood groups, research that tried to say, how are Aboriginal people biologically different from others? And Aboriginal communities have really not liked this research at all, and really with good reason, because in earlier periods of Australian history, science was really important in justifying colonisation, in justifying that Aboriginal people were these terms like primitive, that they were inferior to Europeans and they would naturally die out when in contact with Europeans. So these kind of views, which just sound absolutely horrible, were like mainstream science in the late 19th or even the early 20th century. And we really have to remember that. We can't forget that. It was not very long ago that science was being used for ways which I think are absolutely horrible. So this baggage is very much part of genetics. And of course, genetics and eugenics was really important in justifying what my family went through in the Holocaust, that the idea that Jews were genetically inferior, racially inferior, and needed to be exterminated. So I was obviously, sceptical about how genetics might be used in Aboriginal health, but I was also really interested because I could see it would be really interesting to see how the whole field of genetics unfolded. Because as a doctor, I know that genetics is important, and with all of the investment going into genetics, it's only going to become more and more important, and we're finding out amazing things which are really transforming medicine.
And with the Indigenous remains, so if we're finding them, currently in certain sites, what's the process? Do they give you a call up and say, Emma, what do we do?
Yeah, well, I don't deal directly with Indigenous remains, so people like physical anthropologists and Aboriginal heritage specialists would do that. So I'm not involved in actually dealing with them. But where I have been interested in the question of unprovenanced human remains. So this is human remains in museums or elsewhere, sometimes human remains that are owned by Aboriginal organisations but don't have a specific provenance, so we don't know exactly where they're from. And this is one of the potential applications of genetics. So for the last decade or so, I've really watched the unfolding of genetic technologies and how they're impacting on Indigenous communities, and that's been my focus. So that's taken me across a whole range of different issues that I never planned to become an expert in. And, I'm an expert in only a kind of narrow way. But I work with ancient DNA scientists who look at DNA samples of both human remains and also living people to try and figure out the story of ancient Australia, the story of Aboriginal Australia, many, many thousands of years ago. And I also look at the issue of genetic testing and how the kind of 23andMe, Ancestry.com testing for Aboriginal ancestry might impact Australia. And then I also look at precision medicine and how genetic the impact of technologies in medicine, how that might benefit Indigenous people or they might get left behind.
Yes, wow. A quote from an article in the Deakin Disruptor I thought was incredibly interesting. You stated, "One of my main projects for the past 7 years has centred on a large collection of blood samples from dozens of Indigenous communities in the 60s and 70s and preserved in freezers in Canberra for half a century." That is incredibly interesting. What are we doing with those samples?
Yeah, well, that was an amazing project that I was involved with for quite some time. And it started off with a phone call. So I had been looking at genetics in Aboriginal communities and talking to the very few geneticists, genetic scientists who were doing projects with Aboriginal communities. And I'd heard for a few years that there was this collection of blood samples in Canberra and nobody knew what to do with them. But it wasn't until 2010 that I actually managed to find time to pick up the phone and call the professor of genetics at ANU, who was the guardian of the samples, the custodian. And within about 10 minutes of talking, he was saying, "Can you help me figure out what to do with these samples?" So he'd been waiting for my phone call for 15 years. He'd been trying to figure out what should happen to these samples for a long time, since it became clear that there were ethical issues with using them. So these are samples that were collected in the 60s and 70s mostly.
How did they collect them exactly? Are they...
Well, some were collected by scientists who would go to communities and go to missions and through means that it's hard to piece together exactly what people were told because there was no idea of informed consent at that time, or the idea was only just emerging. Again, because of the Holocaust, we have the whole idea of bioethics and informed consent, but that was still kind of in development in the 60s and 70s, and it wasn't until really the late 80s that we started to have consent forms. So back then, probably there were discussions with, say, the elders on a mission and the mission staff, who obviously there was a power relationship there about what the mission staff told you to do. And then the elders in a community would get everyone else to line up and give blood samples. So that was the way that some of the samples were collected. They probably some of the elders might have had a vague idea that this was to, for example, try and understand how Aboriginal people are related to other people in the region. Other samples were collected for medical purposes, so there might have been a screen of everyone in a particular community for a particular disease that was around at the time, and then a small part of those samples would be sent down to Canberra and without the people knowing about it at all.
So what did we conclude, or is there a conclusion of what is going to happen with the samples?
Yeah, there is. So I was working as a consultant with the Australian National University for quite a few years to help them figure out what to do. So we formed a Aboriginal consultative committee of prominent Indigenous people with expertise in relevant areas from outside the university. And I was engaged as a consultant to write a very big book-length report all about the history of the collection, the potential ethical issues, potential cultural issues, and the options for what could be done with the collection. And the committee decided that the university should retain the samples, should keep them, that they were really important. We're talking here about 7,000 samples from about 50 communities, mostly in the top half of Australia. And that they should be retained as a collection that was under Indigenous control. So the Indigenous Majority Board was formed. Mick Gooder, who you might know as the previous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, he was the inaugural chair of the governance board. And it turned out to be the first Indigenous governed genome facility in the world.
Fascinating. This episode is presented by Deakin University. You can find all of the show notes and other great content related to this chat at disruptor.deakin.edu.au or find us on socials at Deakin Research. Emma, I read in your bio that you're also an expert on freezing. You have co-edited a book called Cryopolitics, Frozen Life in a Melting World. What can you tell us about your research on the topic of freezing?
Yeah, so that book, Cryopolitics, was the outcome of a collaboration with my colleague at Yale University, Joanna Radin, and both of us were really interested in these researchers in the middle of last century, who collected blood samples from Indigenous people. So we just described those blood sample collections in the 60s and 70s. So that was only possible because of freezing. And it was only in the 1950s that the technology for transporting samples across long distances, so mobile freezing technologies, was developed. And it was actually developed in the cattle industry and then transferred over into scientific applications. So we got together and organised a whole wider group of scholars to write this book all about freezing. So freezing in medical contexts, including things like cryogenics, so people who, when they're on the verge of death or when they have just when they've medically died, freeze their bodies and this happens particularly in the US, but also in Europe, and they get their bodies maintained in these facilities. I've never been to one, but it must be really creepy, full of these tanks that are keeping these bodies frozen for some future time when they might be thawed out, when we might have the technology to safely thaw them out. So that is really interesting, and also thinking about things like seed banking and banking of genetic material from extinct animals that we hope we can then reanimate again in the future. So
Jurassic Park, bring back the dinosaurs.
That's right. Or even just a few frogs. Or, we don't know. We're losing so much biodiversity. And freezing is both an incredible technology, but also can cause a kind of complacency because we think, well, we'll freeze stuff. That's like a insurance for when things really get terrible.
Like a bit of a Noah's Ark of frozen animal species, I guess. Yeah.
That's right. So there's frozen ark projects, exactly what they're called.
Wow. I'm thinking about all kinds of things where I've, the frozen woolly mammoth, and even in Austin Powers, one of those movies, I don't know if you've seen those, but they actually freeze like a live person and then he gets to go to the future because he's frozen and then he wakes up all. I'm not sure if we're quite up to doing that yet, freezing a live human, and so they can sort of preserve them for the future.
No, we're not up to that. But these people are often, I think, very rich people, because it costs a lot of money, who freeze their bodies are hoping that in the future somebody will thaw them.
Bring them back, yeah.
There's a lot of dystopic ideas that it's probably more likely they might be harvested for organs rather than actually brought back or who knows what. But it is science fiction at the moment. But if you want to spend your money on something, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess we see it too even with, freezing of eggs to have children later in life. Well, we're seeing a lot of technology around freezing. How will this research that you're doing around freezing affect us in the future?
Well, freezing slows down time. It slows down metabolism. It delays things. And that has benefits and has disadvantages as well. One of the things we looked at in the book was the idea that freezing actually stops death from happening entirely. So it tries to move death completely out of our kind of sphere of experience. And if that's by cryogenics is probably the best example, but also trying to delay the death of a species by freezing a part of it. And we really thought about how death is important to life, and imagining life without death is a horror movie in some ways as well. So. Yeah, that was some really interesting reflections that we had.
In regards to your areas of research, if you could change one thing today to best influence our future, what would that be? Just one thing.
Well, in terms of my research, which I described is really about the implications of genetics, and now we call it genomics, for Indigenous people. So in terms of my research, I think that having Indigenous people in charge, in control of new technologies that will affect them is really important. And that is actually happening with the various initiatives that I'm part of, including the Genomics Health Futures Mission, which is this national investment of $500 million. And through my involvement with that, I wouldn't say I've done it, but my involvement of that has really shown me that Indigenous people are really at the table and helping to make decisions and making decisions about technologies that will affect them. So that's a change that I've been really happy to see in the years that I've been involved in this field. But more broadly, the change that we need to see in the world, well, where to start? I mean, there's so many things that need to happen, and obviously climate change is really number one. And addressing climate change is really about addressing it's about addressing social issues, and it's about changing the way that our societies work, and that's a massive challenge. So I suppose my work on freezing and thinking about what happens when we can just delay and delay and delay, I think that was maybe a very small contribution towards the kind of thinking we need to do. But, yeah, there's so much more work to do.
Fantastic. You established the Deakin Science and Society Network in 2017 with the aim of bringing researchers together from all disciplines with the knowledge that to meet the great challenges of this century, scientists, humanities and social science researchers need to work together. Emma, tell us, how is this network going, and what's it like to have so many amazing brains all together solving the key issues of our time?
Well, I worked on this network and have stoked it into being really because I could see the importance of interdisciplinary research. So all of the big questions that we're facing, whether that's energy or climate change or medical technologies, and how to make sure that the effects of these are equitable across the whole of society and across humans and non-humans that we share the planet with. All of these questions need multiple disciplines to even start to think about answers. And my own background has been very multidisciplinary. I've kind of dabbled and not dabbled, I've got grounding in really different disciplines, and particularly within the sciences, within the biomedical sciences, and within anthropology and the social sciences. So I really wanted to create opportunities for those kind of collaborations to happen, and universities there are a lot of barriers in place in universities to working across disciplines and working across faculties. So I wanted to create some incentives to face those barriers, to face those challenges.
Wow, it sounds fascinating, and I can't wait to see what you guys are working on in that network. Emma, we have a fast few set of questions for you. So strap in. Are you ready? She's shaking her head no. Emma, what is the best piece of advice you've been given on your path to success?
Oh, I've been told by some people that I'm kind of known for not taking any advice.
I love it. So yeah. Okay, that's a great answer. That's one of the best ones we've had. And thinking of our future, Emma, is time really our most precious, unrenewable resource, and why?
I don't have the hours in the day to answer that question.
Well, you can just freeze things. So, we can buy ourselves more time with freezing.
Oh, yeah, I wish. I wish I could freeze the world and have that extra week, month, year to get everything done.
If you could recommend one book to the younger generation to get them on the right path to ensure our Earth's future, what would it be?
The Lorax, which probably they've already read.
What's that book about?
Oh, it's a Dr. Seuss, which kind of reveals my literature tastes at the moment. But, yeah, I've been reading the Lorax every night. I pretty much know it off by heart. But it's written in the 1970s, and it is an environmental tale
Beautiful. We will link to that in the show notes as well. And lastly, if your life was a movie, what would it be called and who would star in it?
I'm phoning a friend.
Who are you? Who did you ask? Are you asking your mum?
I asked my mum because my daughter is at school and she can't help me. She would help me. Intrepid going where angels fear to tread. I don't know what that is. Does that make any sense to you?
We will find out. Oh,
Okay.
Maybe it's because you're delving in things, that other people are sort of scared to delve in.
Okay, I've had Wonder Woman.
Oh, yes.
Suggestion from my phone a friend.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
you are Wonder Woman. Even when I read your bio, I was like, wow, Emma has done everything. She has done so many years of study and research, and so Wonder Woman's definitely
I'm going to
definitely
regret
a great
that.
one.
I'm already regretting that.
Emma, this has been so insightful, and I really hope you get the nickname of Wonder Woman because you are doing some amazing things. Thank you so much for joining us today on Change One Thing.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to review, subscribe, and share with your friends.